you may have heard something about the attempts to roll back some of the critical regulations in Dodd-Frank, in the legislation passed after the financial crisis of 2008. We are approaching the first of several milestone anniversaries in that crisis. And I would say our next guest was the first and perhaps the most thorough debunker of the claims about these quote-unquote revisions to Dodd-Frank that have garnered the support of 16 Democratic senators, as well as the lockstep support of every Republican. So here to talk about that with us now, returning to the program, is David Dayen. David is a contributor to The Intercept. He is also published or has been published in The Nation, New Republic, all sorts of other places. And he is also the author of Chain of Title, a book about three ordinary Americans who uncovered foreclosure fraud on Wall Street. Very good book. I recommend it highly. And he joins us now. So first of all, David, thanks for coming on the program.
Well, thanks for having me on again.
Always a pleasure, although the topic under discussion is maybe not so much of a pleasure. It is the story of, well, I would say it's the story of Wall Street's ongoing political influence in Washington, D.C. Is that a fair summation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no real rationale or constituency for a bank deregulation bill at this time. Even if you believed that community banks were burdened by all the regulatory requirements in Dodd-Frank, the truth is that community banks are thriving. Loan growth is higher at community banks than it is at non-community banks. And of course, the big banks on Wall Street are experiencing record profits. So there's no real need to deregulate the banking sector right now in any form or fashion. And yet you have this bipartisan support at a time of legislative gridlock on Capitol Hill, where no major provisions or legislation is moving except for this thing. And it just shows you that bipartisanship is kind of another name for watch your wallet. It's only bipartisan if big money interests want it.
Well, you know my definition of bipartisan, which is it's that process by which you buy members of both parties. So I don't know. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how this came to be. We're talking about Senate Bill 2155, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And it initially started as a bill to provide relief to the community banking sector. Community banks have a really kind of a sterling reputation on Capitol Hill. And the idea was that Dodd-Frank put in all these blanket rules, and they needed help from a compliance standpoint, because they're being burdened with this in the same way that big banks are, and big banks can afford it and community banks can't. Now, the truth is that community banks are already exempt from most Dodd-Frank rules, but when they say jump, Congress says how high. So initially it started that way. It was supposed to be a bill to provide relief for community banks, and there was broad bipartisan support on that. But as it went forward, Republicans demanded that bigger banks also get a cut of this thing. If the train is moving, the big banks have to get on it. So it became this kind of Christmas tree that has all of these provisions that have nothing to do with community banks, that help large regional banks who have as much as $250 billion in assets. I call them stadium banks. They're not big enough to be mega banks, but they're big enough to pay for a stadium to be named after them somewhere in the country. And then there are even more provisions for the biggest banks on Wall Street. The Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, there are parts of this bill that will allow them to take on more risk, to reduce the amount of equity that they hold, that they can pay for their own mistakes. It will help them evade certain stringent regulations. And in exchange for this, there's really nothing for consumers. In fact, this bill takes away some consumer protections, and it also restricts the ability of regulators to detect discriminatory lending. This is one of the most amazing parts of this bill, that it exempts almost 85% of all banks and credit unions from these new requirements that Dodd-Frank put in to detect racial discrimination in lending, which I don't understand the rationale for that whatsoever.
Well, yeah, I wanted to ask you about racial discrimination, that provision. There's so much we can talk about, but let's start there because it's very eye-catching. It's very shocking. The notion that banks that appear to be doing quite well anyway somehow need congressional protection or reassertion of their right to discriminate racially against American consumers. To me, the only logic I can see for it is that they want to do it. They have lobbyist money, and so they're going to get Congress to allow them to do it. I don't see anything that says racial discrimination makes a bank. It would be objectionable even if it did, but I don't see any logic that says, for example, well, we have to behave in a racially discriminatory way because it makes us financially more healthy. I mean, maybe it's a way to maximize profits, but I don't see any rational defense for it other than the fact that they want to do it. They want to redline or do whatever else they do that might be discriminatory. They've got the clout, so they're going to get Congress to let them do it.
Right. I mean, the sort of nominal defense here is that this is just too burdensome. That what happened was Dodd-Frank put in new requirements under a law called the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act that would force banks to give up more data showing credit scores, showing debt-to-income ratio, all of these things where patterns can emerge. You can see that Black or Latino borrowers were being charged higher rates, or that they were being redlined, not enabled to take loans. And we know this is a huge problem. There was a recent Center for Investigative Reporting series on this, showing that in most major metropolitan areas, there still exists redlining, this discriminatory intent to stop people of color from getting mortgage loans. And they say that these new requirements, that many banks say that these new requirements are burdensome. But the truth is that they collect this data already. What they don't want to do is give it to the government. That's really the only thing that's different here. They collect this data for their own files. They don't want the government to have it because then they can do a better job of detecting these patterns and finding this racially discriminatory intent within the home lending process. So the whole thing is kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, I know they collect the data, and having worked in IT myself, I'm going to guess it would take a mid-level programmer 24 hours to, pull that stuff and send it out. It is, so, the language is burdensome. It seems to me there's a simple rhetorical trick that the bank lobbyists and their friends in Congress pull. And that's, first of all, they use community banks as a cover. We're talking about banks that are Deutsche Bank, for example. We're not talking about Jimmy Stewart in A Wonderful Life here, right? We're not in Bedford Falls anymore. So they use community banks as a smokescreen, that phrase, and because community banks are popular, and it sounds good, and they use burdensome as a word that to people, they're hoping that if people are kept uninformed enough, it'll be, geez, we don't want to make poor old Jimmy, do more than he has to do. But to me, it's a hoax. Isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, sure. I mean, community banks, just that whole term. The bill takes away enhanced regulatory standards from banks that have as much as $250 billion in assets. Those banks will now be treated like they're a community bank. Countrywide, when it was serving and issuing 1 out of every 5 mortgages in this country and most of the subprime mortgages, and helped cause the spectacular collapse that we had in 2008, they had $200 billion in assets. So a bank that is less than $250 billion in assets, absolutely, we know this historically, has the possibility of creating a systemic risk and a systemic event if and when they collapse. And so, yes, they use this community bank idea as a fig leaf, really, to a human shield to run in protections for much bigger banks who have much more money to give to these members of Congress who they want to do their bidding. You know, the top 3 members of Congress in the Senate this cycle who have received donations from commercial banks are Heidi Heitkamp, John Tester, and Joe Donnelly. And those 3 Democrats are the 3 lead Democrats in the Banking Committee who wrote this bill. So the pay to play here is pretty obvious. Now,
when you say the top 3 recipients of bank funds, are you talking about among Democrats or for the Senate as a whole?
No, I'm talking overall. This is for the Senate as a whole. They have received more money than Mike Crapo, who is the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee. So it's very clear that Democrats, moderate Democrats, Democrats up for re-election in 2018, were targeted to give these favors to very large banking interests, and they went along willingly with that. And by the way, Sherrod Brown, who's the ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee, could easily have gone there. He represents a state that went to Trump. He's up for re-election in 2018. He has 3 of these stadium banks in his own state that have headquarters there. It would have been very easy for him to say, hey, my parochial interests mean that I have to go along with this. But of course, he hasn't. He has said that we have a collective amnesia around the idea that these banks can't fail. You know, 10 years ago this week, we saw the Bear Stearns run where this giant investment bank collapsed. And 6 months later, we had Lehman Brothers and the financial crisis. This can absolutely happen again. And the way it happens again is when you take your eye off the ball and start deregulating the banking sector and basically telling the interests at the large financial institutions that it's open season again. You can go to the casino again. You can start up the machines again, and you can take as much risk as you want. And don't worry, on the back end, we'll bail you out.
Yeah, I think that's extremely well said, David Dayen. And before I let you go, there's one other topic I want to hit. You know, I know there's so much we could talk about. I know there's an amendment out to this that's supposed to fix the problems, and I know you've written about it. It doesn't fix the problems at all. Senate claims to fix it. You're the headline in The Intercept of your piece. Senate claims to fix its Wall Street bill, but a look at the text says it's still a giveaway. But I do also want to talk about the role of Citigroup in this, because you were the first, as far as I know, to break the story that Citigroup wanted to make sure there were some goodies for itself in all of this and has a role to play. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's a couple things, but the main thing is a change to what is called the supplementary leverage ratio. And in simplest terms, that means that banks need to hold a certain amount of equity so that if there's a loss, they can use that equity to pay it off rather than having taxpayers pay it off. And there was a change made in the bill that was supposed to only be targeted to what are called custodial banks. These are banks that don't really make loans. They just sort of hold assets for very rich individuals or mutual funds, and they perform administrative activities. It was only supposed to affect these custodial banks. And Citigroup got angry at that and said, hey, why aren't we getting help from this ability to increase our leverage, increase more risk? And they got a change made in the language of the bill. If you go to the congressional record, you can see the part of the bill that was crossed out and exchanged with this new language that Citigroup requested And the Congressional Budget Office has looked at this and said that now that this language is in, there's a 50-50 chance that Citigroup and JP Morgan Chase will be able to take advantage of this thing that allows them to ramp up leverage, which produces higher returns for banks, but also increases risk and the ability and the potential for failure. And so I've been calling it the Citigroup carve-out. And it remains intact to this day. And that 50-50 chance, by the way, is, I think, a bit enhanced by the fact that Donald Trump's regulators are going to be the ones making this determination. And they're not exactly the kind of people who really get tough on the banking industry.
No, that's for sure, and it's a strange pass in history, Dave, when we find, I can only think our best hope lies with the fact that Trump's regulators seem to have more loyalty to Goldman Sachs, whereas Citigroup is friendlier with the Democratic Party. So, and if that's our best hope for financial survival in the years to come, we are in bad shape. Well, as always, David Dayen, thanks for the great reporting, and thanks for the clear breakdown of what's going on, and thanks for coming on the program.
All right, thank you for having me.